Welcome again to ASP.NET Core tutorial. Today we will start a new concept in ASP.NET Core and we will learn about routing in ASP.NET Core. Let's start. We will learn what is routing, how can we configure routing in ASP.NET Core MVC project. Then we will learn what are the types of routing in ASP.NET Core, and at the last we will learn how can we set the default route in ASP.NET Core. Let's start. Before learning about the concept of routing, let's understand the basic concept. Suppose I have created a web application using ASP.NET Core MVC template and I have deployed this application on a particular server. Inside this application, suppose I have 4 controllers. I can also have more than 4 controllers in this application. Now let's assume each controller has multiple action methods. So this is the setup for our application on server. Now I have a browser. So here is my client, or you can say browser, and now I am typing a URL in this browser and I am pressing enter. Then what will happen? A request will go from this browser to the server, and based on the URL we will get the data from the server. Now here you need to think what exactly is happening behind the scene when I am sending a URL and how it gets mapped to a particular action method of a controller. This all is possible just because of routing. Routing in ASP.NET Core is basically a mechanism that map the incoming request or the URL to a particular resource of your application. Routing is the process of mapping incoming HTTP request to a particular resource. What is the request? The URL that you are passing into your request and the type of your request. So the type of the request may be get type, post type, put type. So the combination of that type and the URL that makes a perfect route. And the main purpose of routing is to map that URL to a particular resource. And what is the resource? The resource is controller and action method. If you have seen my previous videos about controller in ASP.NET Core, at that time we were learning that the main flow of any application is maintained by the action method, and to navigate in between all these action methods we need the concept of routing. We can define a unique URL for each resource. Suppose in your application you have multiple controllers and multiple action methods. With the help of routing we can define a unique URL for each resource. You can also define a pattern. So by using that pattern you can also access all of them. But if you want to define them with a unique pattern, then you can also do that easily by using routing. Now here if we need to enable the routing in ASP.NET Core application, then we need to enable some middlewares. So in ASP.NET Core we can enable routing through middleware. In order to use the routing in ASP.NET Core, we need to use these two middlewares. First one is use routing, and if you are using use routing, then you need to use endpoints as well. If you are using these two middlewares in your application, then you can enable the routing. Let's open the Visual Studio and let's have a look on both these middlewares. Here again I am using the Bookstore web application, and inside this Bookstore web application, if I open this startup class, let's scroll down a little bit. Over here you can see inside this configure method we are already using this app.useRouting middleware, and if you are using this use routing, then you must use this use endpoints. Let's forget everything that is written inside this method, but here you need to understand that we need to use two middlewares if we want to enable routing in our application. Now let's focus what are the types of routing in ASP.NET Core. First one is conventional routing and second one is attribute routing. In this video we will focus little bit on the conventional routing, but if you are developing your application, then I would recommend to go with the attribute routing. So attribute routing is the best and easiest way of using routing in any ASP.NET Core application. Now let's set up a default route in ASP.NET Core application. If you are new to ASP.NET Core MVC application development, then I believe you must have noticed one thing. Whenever you need to create a controller, then everyone tells you about home controller, and inside that home controller you need to define an action method with name index. And surprisingly, if you will run your application, then whatever you have written inside your index method of home controller, that will get displayed onto the browser. how this all is happening. What is the logic that the index action method inside home controller gets called automatically? Why not the other action methods? Okay, so by now since we are using two middlewares, app.useRouting and app.useEndpoints, it means the routing is enabled. Now we need to tell our application that whenever a request will come, then you need to match those URLs to a particular resource by using some pattern. Let's see how to do that. So I'm going to comment this line for a while and let's focus on this one. Okay, so here you can notice that I'm using this endpoints that we have defined over here, and now I'm using map controller route method. Inside this map controller route method, I am passing two things. First one is name. The name is default and here is the pattern. Let me remove this book F for a while. Okay, now just focus on the pattern. Here we are writing controller, then we are writing action, and at the last we are using ID. Do not worry about this home. Let me remove this one from here. Now the pattern is very simple. First one is controller, then we have action, and then we have ID. Here you need to focus on a concept of this pattern. If you are writing something into this curly bracket, then it means that that thing is a variable that will get replaced by some other value. Like the controller we have written, it means this place will get replaced by some other value. Similarly, if you are writing something over here like this action, it means that this section or this part will get replaced by some other value. Similarly, here as well. So it means we are just creating a pattern. And what is the pattern? That first of all, we need to write the name of our controller. Then we need to define the name of our action. And then if there is any parameter to it, then we can use the third one, and that should be ID. And here if you will notice that we are using a question mark at the last one. Why we are using this question mark? It means this ID is optional. If you will pass this ID, then it will work. If you will not pass this ID, then there will not be any error and only this part will work into picture. Now let's run this application in debug mode. This time you can notice that our application is working, but there is no page onto the browser. Why? Because at this moment our application does not know how to serve this default route, how to map this default route to a particular resource. What are the default values for the controller and action? Now if I will pass some values to it like home, because first we need to define the name of our controller and then the name of our action method, then you will see we are getting the page. Similarly, if you will click on this about, then you can see that first we have home, that is the name of our controller, and then we have about us, and this about us is the name of our action method. Let's match these values to the pattern that we have defined into our application. So first we have defined the controller name, and here is the controller name, the name is home. Then we have the action method name, and here is the action method name, and that is how it is working. And I have already told you that first we are writing controller name, then the action method name. Now what will happen if I want to change the order of this particular pattern? We can do that easily. Suppose instead of writing this action at the last, I want to do it at the first level. Now what will happen? The pattern has been updated, and as per the new pattern, we need to define the name of our action at the first, then the name of our controller as the second one. Let's run this application again. So by default, because our application does not know where to go, that is why we are getting this page. Now as per the new pattern, we need to define the name of our action method first. So first we need to define index, then the name of our controller. And now you will see that we are getting the home page of our application. Again, if you will click on some other link, like I'm clicking on this about, then you can see that first we are having about us, and then we have how all these things are getting replaced automatically, because we are using the anchor tag helper that is provided by the tag helpers of ASP.NET Core. And if you have seen all the previous videos, then you can relate to all those concepts over here. As per the pattern, the value gets changed automatically. But now if you will use the previous concept like home and then slash about us, then you will get an error. So there will be no page. What does it mean? It means you can define this pattern as per your need. So there is no hardcore rule that first you need to define the controller then action method. No, you can set up the route, the pattern as per your requirement. But because the default one is controller and action method and then the parameter, then we simply use that pattern. So again we are using the old pattern. Now let's focus on this id parameter. How will this work? So right now you can see that we were not passing any parameter and we were not even getting any error. But what will happen if I pass some parameter to it? First let's open the home controller, and here we can use any action method. So suppose I'm using this about us, so here I can simply write int id, and let's put a breakpoint over here, and let's run this application in debug mode. By default you will see we are getting an error. That's fine. Now we need to define the name of our controller and action method. So if I am passing home and index, then it is working fine. Now we need to test the parameter of this particular URL. So let's click on this about page. This time you can see that we are not passing any parameter into the URL. That is why we have id is equals to 0. Let's click on the continue button. This page is working fine because we are not passing any parameter to this URL. Now what will happen if I pass any value to it? So as a third part of this URL, I can simply write any value in the integer and then click on the enter button. And this time you can notice that inside this id parameter we are having a value that is coming from the URL. Let's click on the continue button. Now suppose along with this parameter I want to add one more parameter to this, then you can also do that easily. So here again suppose you can simply write name, and the name is also optional. Now let's modify the code into the controller action method as well. So suppose here I'm writing a string name, and let's again run this application in debug mode. Okay, let's enter the URL. So it is home and then index. It is working fine. Let's click on the about button. So this time we are not passing any value. That is why here you can notice that we have id is equals to 0 and name is equals to null, and these are the default values of these types. Let's click on the continue button. This time there is no error, everything is working fine. But now suppose I want to pass some values to it. So let's enter 13 and let's enter a name Nitish. So here is the new URL. If I click on the enter button again, this time you will notice that inside the id parameter I am having 13, and inside the name parameter I am having the value that we are passing from our URL. This is how you can pass all the values to your URL. You can also pass the values by using query string into your URL. Let's see how to do that. Now suppose I do not want to set this value over here, and I want to use the query string. So how can I do that? Let's run this application in debug mode again, and let's open the about us page directly. So this time you will notice that inside the id we have 0 and inside the name we have null. So it is working fine. Now I want to pass some values by using query string. So because we have written the id over here, so I can simply pass 13 or 14 or whatever the id is, and then for the second parameter I need to use a question mark. Then I need to type the name of my parameter. The name of parameter is name, so here I can write name, then equals to and the value of this particular parameter. Suppose here I'm writing Nitish K and click on the enter button. And this time you will notice that inside the id we have a value and inside the name we also have a value. So there are two ways. First one is you can define your parameter type into the URL, and second one is query string. So this is how we can pass our data by using any one of the format. But now if I click on the home button or this bookstore logo, then you will notice that we are getting an error. Now we need to resolve this error. We can resolve this error by applying some default values to our pattern. Let's see how to do that. So again let's go back to the startup class. Now let's add some default values to these options. So suppose for the action I want to define a default value, that is index. Perfect. Now what will happen if I am not passing any value in the action part? Then automatically the index will be assigned. Let's see how it works. So if I run this application in debug mode again, let's enter only home. So here you can notice that I am only entering the name of my controller, and automatically you can see that we are getting the home page of our application. Now if I open the book controller, inside the book controller you can notice that right now we do not have any method with name index. So suppose you have one method with name index over here, and then you will pass only the book into the URL. Then the index action method of this book controller will get called automatically, And this is the exercise for you. You need to try all these things by yourself. Now let's set the default values for the controller as well. So here I can write home, and let's run this application again. Now what will happen, if you will not pass the name of the controller or action, then automatically home and index will get called. And that is why we are getting this home page without even passing anything into this URL. You can also update it to some other action method. Suppose inside the home controller I have about us or contact us, so you can use any one of them. Instead of using index, suppose this time I am using about us. Let's run this application again by pressing Ctrl F5, and this time you will notice that the default page of this application will be the about us page. Here you can notice into the URL that we do not have anything, and still we are getting the about us page. This is how you can work on the default route for this particular application. Now let's learn about this map default controller route as well. Let's comment this method for a while by pressing Ctrl C, and let's enable this line. Okay, let's run this application again. This time you can see that we are not passing any value into the URL. Still we are getting the home page, and it is still pointing to the home controller and index action method. How is this working? Let's see the details of this particular method. So here you can notice the name of method is map default controller route. Let's right click on this method and choose go to definition. Let's expand the comment section for this particular method, and here you can notice adds endpoint for controller action to this router and adds the default route, and here is the default pattern. So if you are using this method, then automatically it use this pattern, and here you can see that we have defined the same pattern. Controller is equals to home and action is equals to index. So there is no magic into the routing, it is simply just the pattern that we have already defined. Now I believe that the confusion of home controller and index action method will be clear now. Now suppose I want to set up some more routes to my application, then how can I do that? So let's copy this entire code and paste it again. Let's uncomment all these lines. Remember, I have already written over here that the pattern is something that will get matched to a particular action method. And suppose for the about us page, I want to set a URL like about us. Let's update the name as well. So suppose I want to set a pattern for the about us page of this application, then we need to define three things over here. First one is the name, then the pattern, and then the default values. What are the default values? For the controller, the value is home, and for the action method, the value is about us. Let's copy the name from this home controller. Perfect. Now if I run this application by pressing Ctrl F5, then by default you will see that we are having the home page, that is the index one, and if I click on the about, then you can see still we are having the previous URL, but you can also call it by using this about us. Here you can notice that we are still having the about us page, and this way of defining the routing is called as conventional routing. So you can define all the routes over here by using this endpoints.mapControllerRoute method. Suppose you want a separate URL for the contact us, then you can define that here, and if you want to pass some parameters to it, so you can simply use n/ and then define your parameters like this. If the ID is mandatory, then there is no need to define any question mark. If it is optional, then you can simply define a question mark to it. Now let's learn few important points about routing. All the routes should be unique with the combination of URL and HTTP method. What does it mean? So suppose you are calling a resource by using a route which has the same name, but the HTTP verb is different, then those will be treated as different. It means they will be unique. So the actual combination is HTTP method, it means HTTP verb, and what are the verbs? Get, put, post, etc. URL, the text that you have written into the browser, and the type, that makes a unique combination. We can define multiple routes for one resource, but we cannot define the same route for multiple resources. And if you are doing that, then you will get an ambiguity error. If you are using the order into your routes, then you will not get that error. By default, the route that has higher priority that will get called automatically. But if you are using two routes with same order, then at that time your application will be in the state of ambiguity and you will get an error onto your browser. I hope after watching this video, the basic concept of routing in ASP.NET Core will be clear. Routing is a very important concept for any application. In the next video, we will learn more about attribute routing, and attribute routing is one of the most used way of routing in any ASP.NET Core application. Don't forget to hit the like button. You can ask your questions into the comment section. Kindly share this video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching. Have a great day.